At the end of the Middle Ages, a mighty nation arose on the borderlands between Europe and Asia, a land called Russia. A dynasty of Viking princes would lift Russia to greatness. The greatest of their line, Tsar Ivan the Terrible, would cast Russia into chaos. Out of the ashes would rise a giant, a new Russian empire, and the man who created it, sailor, soldier, carpenter, Tsar, Peter the Great. Russia. In the words of Winston Churchill, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. Even today, years after the fall of communism, Russia retains a sense of mystery, and Russia's history remains a riddle. The enigma that is Russia begins long ago, before Stalin, before Lenin, before the Reds took power. Russia was ruled by the Romanov dynasty for 300 years. Yet even the Romanovs are relative newcomers. The birth of the Russian Empire reaches back over 1,000 years to an age when history tangled with myth and a nation found its identity in a mystical faith. At its peak, the empire of the Tsars would span 1/6 of the globe. From the glories of St. Petersburg and Moscow, across the endless forests of Siberia, to the shores of the Pacific and beyond.
The land which is currently Russia is, of course, enormous.
The distance between one end of the Russian Empire and the other end of the Russian Empire is the same as the distance from Moscow to Chicago.
And part of the story of the history of Russia is the filling up of that space.
The land that would be Russia was never a single country. The Russian people, never a single race. Turks and Slavs, Mongols and Finns, Russia is a nation of many nations, a land not of one people, but of many different peoples.
All those groups have different patterns of settlement, obviously speak different languages, and have no sense of being part of a coherent land at all.
Before Russia became a nation, what connected the people of the Eurasian frontier were rivers, endless, awesome rivers.
Rivers were the highways, rivers were the roads, the rivers were the connections between the widely scattered populations. The rivers provided the force lines drawing people together.
The rivers are absolutely essential to the expansion of the Russians in every direction and to the creation of this kind of enormous state. Without the rivers, they could never have held it together.
In the 9th century, Viking warriors sailed down the rivers at the edge of Europe, the Dnieper, the Don, the Volga. The Vikings pioneered new trade routes, a shortcut to the riches of the Orient, Arabia, and Constantinople. Natives along the rivers called the Vikings the Rus, and as the Vikings battled and bartered their way to power, the frontier between Europe and Asia became known as the land of the Rus, Russia.
One of the stories of Russian history is how gradually links are forged in a very small way. Strands emerge, beginnings of connections happen and begin to intertwine. Then one turns around and, good heavens, we have a place called Russia.
By the late 10th century, the land that would be Russia was a patchwork of warring city-states. Rival Viking princes battled for supremacy. The greatest of these ancient cities was Kiev, and Vladimir, Grand Prince of Kiev, was the most powerful man of the land of the Rus. But Vladimir wasn't content to be first among equals. The Grand Prince sought greater power, to reign over the Rus as a God-given ruler.
One of the things which a would-be ruler of that large and diverse land needed was some central focus of authority, some sort of central cult which would give him a legitimacy and authority beyond simply the use of military force.
In the legends of Russia's birth, Prince Vladimir searched for a single religion to bind together the many pagan peoples of the Rus. According to ancient texts, Vladimir sent out emissaries and met with the Jews, the Muslims, and the Catholics in a quest to find the one true faith. Then his men came to Constantinople. Here, in the heart of the Christian Orthodox world, Vladimir's envoys at last found the power and glory their grand prince craved. Constantinople's might and splendor helped convince Vladimir to convert to the Orthodox faith. Then, as God's agent on earth, he commanded his subjects be baptized as Christians, or face his wrath. Prince Vladimir had united the land of the Rus with religion, but at his death, he left his kingdom divided among his sons. Civil war between rival brothers threatened to tear the kingdom apart. In the year 1237, having conquered the eastern world, the Mongol horde, the sons of Genghis Khan, unleashed their fury on the west and the land of the Rus. The Mongol horde was the greatest war machine in history. Tens of thousands of men on horseback, organized to murderous perfection. In just 3 years, they subdued almost all of Russia. In over 1,000 years of history, only the Mongols would ever accomplish that feat.
They came in huge numbers. They came prepared for long-distance campaigns.
Their campaigns would normally have between maybe 50,000 to 100,000, and if we're to believe some sources, well in excess of 100,000 soldiers.
Mongol warriors trapped Russian armies and cut them to pieces. They captured Russian princes and held them hostage. They torched Russian cities and left them in ruins. In 1240, the Mongols' leader, Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, laid siege to the soul of ancient Russia, the city of Kiev. His messengers sent a warning.
If you surrender to me, you will be forgiven. If you resist, you will suffer greatly and perish cruelly.
Kiev chose death. Refusing to submit to the invaders, the greatest city in the land of the Rus was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Some accounts claim that when the Mongols rode on to the west, they left Russia littered with the skulls of the dead. So began the reign of the Golden Horde. It would last for 2.5 centuries. The leaders of the horde were Mongol warriors. Their soldiers were Eastern Turkic tribes. In time, the Russians would call them all Tatars. Yet the Tatars never sought to occupy Russia, only to dominate it through tribute and terror. Their use of horror had been honed in the conquest of Asia. Murderous Mongol yoke reduced the princes of Russia to underlings. To hold on to his throne, a prince came to the court of the Tatar Khan, literally cap in hand, to feed the horses of his overlords. After his humiliation, he would pay the Khan a lavish tribute, the price of princely power. The Mongols had divided the Rus. Only a united people would be strong enough to resist their rule. Over time, the lords of one city learned to hold the Mongols' favor, even though their city was an upstart, barely a century old. The city of Moscow. Moscow was founded as an isolated river outpost in the 12th century. But by the 1300s, Moscow was a growing city built around a great fortress, her Kremlin. Yet as their power grew, Moscow's princes chafed under the grip of the Khan. Over time, the Muscovites acquired the resources to build an army and turn against Russia's oppressors. In 1380, Dmitri, Moscow's new Grand Prince, rallied over 50,000 warriors from across the land. On the banks of the River Don, Prince Dmitri led Russia into battle for freedom from the Mongol horde. 100 years of struggle for freedom had only just begun. As internal power struggles splintered the Mongols into rival factions, Moscow rebuilt and grew. By the late 15th century, the wealth and power of Moscow's new Grand Prince, Ivan III, rivaled even the Mongol Khan. For 2.5 centuries, Russian rulers had paid the Khan for the privilege of power. In 1480, Ivan of Moscow cut the Mongols off. Faced with a united Russian front, the Tatar armies could no longer dominate the battlefield, or the Rus. The Mongol Khan abandoned control of Russia to Moscow and her Grand Prince. Prince Ivan III had united the Russians under the banner of Muscovy and beaten back the Mongol horde. Soon Ivan would take a new title for himself, Tsar, absolute imperial ruler of all the Russias. In 1453, Constantinople, the holy city of Orthodox Christianity, fell to Muslim invaders. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, was dead. A new empire, a new emperor, would soon arise. In the Orthodox Christian citadel of Moscow, Grand Prince Ivan III began to transform his dominion into a holy Russian empire. For centuries, the Byzantine double eagle had been the symbol of absolute authority. Ivan now claimed it as his personal emblem. To lift his line to imperial blood, he took a wife, Zoe, a niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Moscow's royal family even devised a new family tree, tracing their line back to Rome and the Caesars. And so, in 1493, the Muscovite prince began to adopt the imperial title of the Byzantine emperors, Tsar, Russian for Caesar. As Prince Ivan remodeled himself as a Russian Caesar, he remade Moscow and its Kremlin into a new Rome, an imperial, holy city. Ivan brought in the finest architects from Italy. He charged them to raise monuments to God's glory and Moscow's power. For a finale, Ivan's architects enlarged and restructured the Kremlin fortress itself. They encircled it with stone ramparts 16 feet thick and crowned by 19 towers. A royal city within the city, filled with palaces, armories, and churches. In the endless lands outside Moscow, Ivan the Great also began to change the rules of life for Russia's rural majority. Once, peasants had been free to farm wherever they found open land. By paying tax or tribute, they could grow crops on fields belonging to noblemen or the church. If the land grew tired or taxes too heavy, the farmers moved to greener pastures. Tsar Ivan issued decrees crippling the peasants' traditional right to roam. Now, only once a year, in the depths of the frigid Russian winter, could peasants leave one landlord for the fields of another. The peasants were not yet serfs, slaves bound to the land, but Ivan had begun their journey into bondage. Ivan's death in 1505 would bring his son Vasily to the throne. And perhaps the most historic act Vasily Ivanich would make was not as an empire builder, but as a lover. Behind the gates of a convent, the prince locked away his first wife, Salomea. She had failed to give him a child, and so he took a new bride, Elena. The Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem condemned Vasily's sinful second marriage.
You will have a wicked son. Your states will be prey to terror and tears. Rivers of blood will flow. Your cities will be devoured in flames.
The Patriarch's fearful prophecy would prove all too true. August 25th, 1530. The omens were awesome at the birth of Prince Vasily's son. Legend says the sky split open and lightning struck the Kremlin. The night Ivan IV, heir to the Russian throne, was born. Bells spread the news across the land. The tyrant history would remember as Ivan the Terrible had been born. But almost from birth, young Ivan was a prisoner of the Kremlin and its intrigues. The death of his father Vasily, when Ivan was only 3, set off a deadly power struggle. The young Grand Prince watched as Russia's powerful noblemen, the boyars, fought for control. Moscow's high priest, the Metropolitan, was battered and broken before his eyes. Murder, intrigue, treachery. Prince Ivan of Moscow came of age watching boyars wage a ruthless struggle for the power of his crown. When the time came to claim his birthright, the Grand Prince made it clear. The boyar struggle was over. The crown and the power belonged to Ivan alone. The first prince formally crowned Tsar, Ivan's imperial title echoed the awesome scope of his realm. From the Ural Mountains at Europe's eastern edge to the headwaters of the great Dnieper and Volga rivers, Russia already spanned close to 1 million square miles, twice as large as England, France, and Spain combined. And across all that land, one man reigned supreme. Even with all Russia at his command, Ivan wanted more. He dispatched armies to expand his dominion, east and west. Under its new Tsar, the land commonly called Muscovy would become a nation of nations, a true empire. In 1552, Ivan and his army lay siege to the Tatar stronghold of Kazan. The fortress of the Khan commanded the lower Volga, the Viking trade route to the riches of the Orient. Ivan prayed before holy relics, while his warriors stormed the gates. The Tatar fortress fell. Ivan's eastern armies never looked back. By 1556, Russia ruled the Volga River route all the way to the Caspian Sea. Kazan and Astrakhan, lands that had long been the Tatars' home, now belonged to the Tsar of Russia. Ivan's passion for land and power was matched in those years by passion for his wife, Anastasia. His bride came from a family destined for the pinnacle of greatness. Anastasia was born a Romanov.
Царицей, он ее очень любил.
When she was his wife, the Tsaritsa, he loved her very much. There were no executions. He behaved very well. All of his contemporaries remember this as the finest time of his reign.
Tsar Ivan was in his glory. His court was rich and strong, his empire expanding. His influence was sought by the Poles, the Germans, the Turks, even the English. And in 1554, his wife, Anastasia Romanova, delivered the Tsar a healthy heir to the throne, a Tsarevich, Ivan Ivanich. Then, in 1560, fate seemed to turn against Ivan. A devastating fire swept across Moscow. Anastasia fell sick with a terrible fever. The Tsar prayed for God to spare his beloved. His plea was met only by Anastasia's death. A new and terrifying Ivan emerged from the ordeal. The fears of his youth revived. Poison had taken his mother. Had Anastasia been poisoned too? Was his throne now the object of a dark conspiracy? The Tsar turned on his advisors, military heroes, trusted noblemen. They were cast into prison, subjected to torture, banishment, or worse. A bitter saying was born: the closer to the Tsar, the closer to death. The Tsar came to be known as Ivan Grozny, a word that translates as awesome or dread, but most commonly as terrible. Finally, on a December day in 1564, Tsar Ivan threw his empire out the door. Faced with another power struggle, he chose instead to quit the Kremlin.
He appealed in a letter to the Moscow people, complaining that he was leaving the post of Tsar because he was not being allowed to rule, that they are stealing, and he is not being allowed to punish them.
The Tsar wasn't just going on a trip. He was moving out for good. Ivan had been Russia's sovereign for over 30 years. Without the Tsar, the Russian people feared the country would fall apart, which was just what Ivan was counting on. Ivan agreed to return, but only on one condition. He must have a free hand to rule Russia as he pleased and punish his enemies any way he chose. 2 days after Ivan's return, the terror began. At the foot of the Kremlin walls, Ivan slaughtered his so-called enemies. He ordered the execution of hundreds, nobles, counselors, even priests. They had opposed his wars, denied his taxes, questioned his sanity. They paid with their lands and their lives. To crush all opposition, the Tsar unleashed his own private army, the Oprichniki, 6,000 murderous thugs. They were cloaked in black and free to slaughter any who questioned Ivan's dark disorder. Still, Ivan's fiery passions were far from spent. Since the death of his first wife, Anastasia, he had married so many times the Orthodox Church would no longer bless the ceremony. Ivan's amorous intentions even extended to England's royal court.
He actually investigates the possibility of a marriage proposal to Mary of Hastings, who was a lady-in-waiting in Elizabeth's court and who is related to Elizabeth herself. And this, too, would have made for a rather strange juxtaposition, Moscow and London, in the age of Shakespeare.
The Tsar had no need of a wife to breed an heir. The succession was assured. Ivan's eldest son, the Tsarevich, shared his father's lust for knowledge and power. Some say even for torture. But on a November evening in 1581, Ivan's terrible passions devoured his joy. The Tsar had never been happy with his son's choice for a bride. This night, disapproval boiled over into bloodshed.
Ivan was furious at the dress of his daughter-in-law and was furious at the way she behaved towards him, which he took to be as a sign of disrespect, and possibly may have begun to manhandle her.
Shocked, Ivan's son and heir turned on his father. The Tsar responded in fury. Blind with rage, Ivan struck out with his heavy iron staff. The Tsarevich, the son of his great love, Anastasia, struck dead by Ivan himself. With the death of his heir, Ivan's life seemed to unravel. Accounts say the Tsar felt haunted by the thousands he'd had killed, not least the murder of his own beloved son. For decades, Tsar Ivan the Terrible had held Russia together with the force of will and fear. Then, in 1584, Ivan died. His reign of terror was over, but the chaos had only just begun. The Russians themselves would call the early 1600s Smutnoye Vremya, the time of troubles. A vicious cycle of hardship spread chaos and despair across the land. To survive, peasants ate grass, bark. Some records claimed they even turned to cannibalism. Russia's rulers fared little better. Fyodor Ivanich, Boris Godunov, Fyodor Godunov, Vasily Shuisky. Between 1598 and 1610, 6 different men claimed the title Tsar, only to die or be deposed. The Kremlin grew so shaky, the throne fell prey to an outright impostor. The pretender came from Poland, claiming to be Tsar Ivan's long-lost heir. The charlatan wore the crown for a year before he was exposed and sent home, Russian style. The Russians killed him, burned his corpse, stuffed his ashes in a cannon, pointed it at Poland, and lit the fuse. After that, things only got worse. In the south, Tatar raids and peasant revolts shattered Moscow's authority. In the north, Sweden, the greatest military power of the day, invaded from the Baltic coast. Then, the Poles flooded across the border. Their armies drove deep into the Russian heartland. In 1610, they captured Moscow. The King of Poland stood poised to add the throne of the Tsars to his dominions. Russia was on the brink of obliteration. In the dungeon of the Kremlin, the Poles imprisoned Russia's last national authority, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church. Not far from death, the Patriarch issued a desperate plea. He begged the Russian people to rise up and save their motherland. Noblemen and peasants alike heard the call and banded together. A national militia arose to retake Moscow. After 2 years of fighting and blood sacrifice, the improvised Russian army liberated Moscow from the Poles. Victorious in saving their capital, the Russian people knew now more than ever they needed a Tsar to survive. The militia's leader, Dmitry Pozharsky.
Without a sovereign, how can we defend ourselves against our common enemies, the Poles, the Swedes, and Russian rogues who stir up strife?
Nobles, merchants, warriors, priests, they assembled to choose a new Tsar. They sought divine authority, a devout Orthodox monarch with blood ties to Ivan the Terrible. In a monastery far from Moscow, they tracked down a distant relative of Tsar Ivan's first wife, a 16-year-old boy, Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. Young Michael at first refused the crown, then bowed to pressure and ambition. July 1613, Mikhail Romanov was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow, autocrat and Tsar of all the Russias. It was the birth of 3 centuries of Romanov family rule. Under the first 2 Tsars of the new Romanov dynasty, Moscow began to reassert control over Russia and her people. Any nobleman who dared challenge central authority faced exile or the loss of his lands. In return for their loyalty, the nobles were soon awarded unprecedented control over the peasants who worked their fields. The chaotic time of troubles had opened a window for the peasants. For years, they walked away from lands, debts, and landlords. The exodus crippled farms across Russia and destroyed the nation's economy. Moscow's solution? Serfdom. Free Russians had been made serfs, slaves, the legal property of the nobles who owned the land. The new law bound peasants, their children, and their children's children to the fields for life. Serfdom, the enslavement of their own people, would haunt the empire and the Romanov dynasty until its demise. The second Romanov Tsar, Alexis Mikhailovich, set other, more promising trends in motion as well. He opened Russia's borders to trade with the West. His armies pushed Russia's eastern border all the way to the Pacific. And even then, Russia's thirst to expand was far from finished. May 30th, 1672, Moscow erupted in celebration. The Tsar's new wife had given birth to a healthy new prince, a boy who would fall in love with boats and war and ideas and power, a boy called Peter. It was clear young Pyotr Alexeyevich would make a perfect Tsar. The problem was he wasn't the next in line for the throne. Peter's father, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, sired two families with two different wives. Peter's half-brothers, Fyodor and Ivan, were both ahead of him in the succession. In the late 17th century, in the kingdom called Muscovy, two brothers sat on the throne of the Tsar. The brother Tsars, Ivan V and Peter I, ruled a far-flung empire of isolated villages, cities, and towns, a place where daily life had changed little since the Middle Ages.
In the 17th century, Muscovy was definitely stuck in a medieval time warp, and it seemed backward by any measures. Muscovite Russia had not experienced the Renaissance. It had not experienced the scientific revolution of the 17th century.
Born in a medieval environment, the young Tsar Peter was captivated by everything modern. Anything new, anything from the West, people, ideas, even clothes. In 1696, Peter's half-brother and co-Tsar, Ivan V, died. As Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov assumed sole control of the Russian throne, he declared his lifelong goal:
to break the bonds of the inflexible customs of Muscovy and to lead this country toward a new day, which shall be better than this.
And for Peter, Russia's new day dawned not in the East, but in the West, in Europe. For Peter, one thing above all symbolized the new Russia he hoped to build: ships, warships, transports, merchant ships. As Tsar, Peter would build his fascination into a navy, a force that would change Russia and the world. But as a potential maritime power, Peter's kingdom had one crippling drawback. Russia, the largest nation on earth, was practically landlocked. In the north, Sweden and Poland held the Baltic coast. In the south, the Ottoman Empire encircled the Black Sea. Peter wanted a seaport for Russia, a window on the world and the West.
He wanted to take Russia out of its Muscovite isolation and backwardness and communicate with the West, communicate with them in terms of technology, in terms of ideas, in terms of exchanging goods. And for that, he needed warm water ports.
At 23, the Tsar set his sights on the Black Sea's warm waters and the Turkish stronghold of Azov. 1695. Peter and his army marched south on Azov. The Tsar posted himself to the front-line artillery. But even with the warrior Tsar manning the guns, the Turks sent Russia home in defeat. The setback gave Peter a new insight. To capture the naval outpost he craved, first he needed a navy to lead the attack. The Tsar ordered up a fleet of battle galleys. He needed them finished in 5 months, but Russia had never been a naval power. First, they had to build shipyards and train the builders before they could build the ships. Peter himself led the effort.
He was right there hammering nails and building, and it was through him that Russia's first navy was created. Nothing resembling a navy had ever existed before Peter.
Next spring, the untested Russian flotilla cruised down the River Don, Peter himself at the helm of his flagship. He insisted his men not call him Tsar or Admiral, but simply captain. On land, the Russian army again attacked the Turks at Azov. And from the sea, Peter and his new navy backed the troops with a withering naval bombardment.
Considering that the first campaign had been a failure and had had very serious, heavy losses, the second time was a piece of cake. So in that sense, he starts a pattern of, even though he might fail initially, he still won't give up on his objective. Militarily speaking, he'll come back even stronger, real quick.
A taste of naval power had at last won Russia a port on the Black Sea. But Peter wanted more. He wanted the secrets of the high-tech warships of the great Western navies. And so the Tsar of Russia left his kingdom to seek out the know-how he craved. No Tsar had ever before set foot outside the kingdom. No Tsar had ever even seen Europe. Peter was going to shatter tradition. The winter of 1697, Peter and some 200 nobles, craftsmen, musicians, servants, and a troop of dwarves headed west on a year-and-a-half-long European road trip. To escape the tedious burdens of royalty, the Tsar himself often masqueraded as a common sailor.
He wanted to absorb as much knowledge as he possibly could without the trappings of formality and court ritual and all of that. So he wanted to, observe unnoticed. It was kind of difficult to be unnoticed, at his height. But he didn't want to be known as the Tsar. He just wanted to be known as a traveling student.
For a self-taught craftsman, Western Europe offered the ultimate education. He studied printing, iron casting, paper making, even how to render whale blubber. He took classes in surgery and anatomy in Leyden, art in Leipzig, and dentistry in Dresden.
He was observing an anatomy course in Holland, and they produced a dissected corpse. And all his comrades grew really squeamish when that happened. I mean, they were just repulsed by this, because it was just an unusual thing at the time.
Peter's greatest hunger was for nautical science. In Holland's finest shipyard, he apprenticed himself to a master shipwright. Then, Russia's carpenter Tsar learned how to build a 28-gun frigate from the keel up. But even with a Dutch ship-of-the-line to his credit, Peter wasn't satisfied. The British ruled the seas, so the Tsar headed for England. For 16 months, Tsar Peter I had reveled in the shipyards and palaces of Western Europe. When he returned home in 1698 and compared his realm with the West, Russia's supreme autocrat wasn't happy. His capital, Moscow, struck Peter as primitive and gloomy. Russia's nobility, the boyars, seemed medieval in their long beards and caftans. The Orthodox Church wielded far too much power, at the Tsar's expense. And to top it off, the Streltsy, the army's die-hard conservative musketeers, were in open revolt. Peter resolved to change it all. He dreamed of a new nation, a westernized Russia, an empire inspired by and wedded to Europe, a gilded land of order, progress, and power. He started his revolution with a little barbering.
He was known to rip people's beards right out with his bare hands at the roots, and beards to him were just something that said old barbaric way. It was a tangible way of dragging the nation forward.
The Tsar ordered a complete change of clothes for his noblemen. Boyars caught in the traditional long kaftans of Muscovy had their robes cut short on the spot. One obsession would shape Peter's entire reign: to create a Russian port on the Baltic coast, a window that would open Peter's kingdom to the world. But in 1700, the Baltic coast belonged to another nation and another bold young king, Charles XII of Sweden. Born and bred a warrior, Sweden's King Charles would make Peter and Russia pay dearly for his Baltic dream. The cost? The blood of thousands and 20 years of war. The duel began late in the year 1700. Peter's army, 40,000 strong, marched on Narva, the Swedes' Baltic stronghold. With only 8,000 men, Charles was outnumbered 5-1. But in a blinding snowstorm, Sweden's warrior king seized the moment.
Now is the time. With the storm at our backs, they will never see how few we are.
The Swedes charged out of the blizzard and completely overwhelmed the Russians.
Peter, who had all these dreams of making Russia a superb military power, met ignominious defeat. His 34,000 soldiers were trounced by Charles's army of 8,000.
Convinced that Russia was a paper tiger, Charles turned west to attack Poland. He would save Tsar Peter for later.
What Narva did to Peter is to convince him that all of the resources of the vast country which was under his control had to be put to serve one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to build Russia into a military power.
Peter seized bells from Russia's churches and melted them down to make cannon. He jacked up taxes to pay for a military buildup. He drafted 45,000 new troops from Russia's peasant families. While Charles and the Swedes were distracted in Poland, Peter's army marched for the sea. By 1703, the Russians had carved out a beachhead on the Baltic, along the shores of the Gulf of Finland. On a boggy island, where the river Neva meets the Gulf, Peter the Great staked his claim.
By nature, we are fated here to cut a window through to Europe. Here shall be a town.
May 1703, the Tsar grabbed an axe and began to build the city he christened St. Petersburg. Never a patient man, Peter wanted his new town to rise as fast as possible. He built his own log house in just 3 days. Peter knew Charles and the Swedes would return and try to force Russia out of the Baltic. He wanted fortresses and fighting ships ready to hurl them back. He wanted a city that Russia would never surrender. He ordered it all built, whatever the cost. Peter drafted thousands of workers to build his new city. Peasants, soldiers, even Swedish prisoners. Often without tools, they dug with their hands. In summer, malaria and mud crippled the work. In winter, ice and scurvy took their toll. Laborers died by the thousands. The Russians would say St. Petersburg was built on bones. More than a new city, St. Petersburg was the foundation of a new society. To dramatize the transformation of his realm, Peter would erect a gilded showcase just outside the city, Peterhof. With his new summer palace, the Russian Tsar sought to outdo even the glories of Versailles. Peter's goals, his new city, his new nation, were more important than any Russian life. He uprooted his entire court and commanded them to build new homes in his window on the west. He even told them how and where to build. When Sweden's King Charles heard of Peter's mad rush to build, he scoffed.
Let the Tsar tire himself out with founding new towns. We will keep for ourselves the honor of taking them later.
In 1708, Charles prepared to make good his boast. The battle-tested Swedish army stormed out of Poland and marched for Moscow. Peter answered with fire, a blanket of fire burning everything in the Swedes' path. Wherever Charles attacked, his troops conquered only scorched earth. By the following winter, the mighty Swedish army was trapped deep in Russian territory, hundreds of miles from their supplies, running short of ammunition and food. Peter waited for spring, then sent his rebuilt army, 60,000 strong, to confront Charles's invaders. In July, the Tsar and the King of Sweden faced off outside the Ukrainian town of Poltava. Crippled from wounds, Charles had to be carried onto the battlefield. But even outnumbered nearly 3-1, Sweden's warrior king still ordered his troops to attack. Sweden's first wave hurled the Russians back. Then Peter's artillery opened fire. Russian guns riddled Charles's troops. Russian conscripts drove them back. Peter's new army was simply too big and too well armed. On the killing fields of Poltava, King Charles's reign of glory was drowned in blood and dust. Russia's absolute ruler, Tsar Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov, would become the new master of the Baltic. Russia was at last a great European power. In 1711, Tsar Peter the Great moved Russia's capital to his triumphant city on the Baltic, St. Petersburg. There was just one problem. The Russian people still considered Moscow the capital. But Peter never let public opinion interfere with his grandiose plans. Peter lived life non-stop. He often traveled over 100 miles a day, in an age when most people might never travel that far in a lifetime. The list of his innovations and reforms seems endless. The first Russian newspaper, the first hospital, the first museum, schools for navigation, geography, mathematics, politics, and astronomy, a new navy, a new army, a new capital. Ultimately, Peter outgrew even his crown. Not content with the old Muscovite title and regalia, Peter ordered a new European-style crown. Then he bestowed on himself a new regal title, not Tsar, but Emperor, autocrat of all the Russias. Still, Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov had come of age in the shadows of the Kremlin. He had seen palace intrigue destroy powerful men. Now in his 40s, Peter knew that his life's work might be erased at his death. The giant of the Romanov dynasty had stumbled and left the greatest empire on earth without a ruler. Winter and doubt gripped Russia. Spring could be foretold, but Russia's future was unknown.